Welcome to this Sussex Development Lecture to everyone watching online through Zoom and YouTube. I'm Jo Westbrook, a co-director of the Centre for International Education here at Sussex, and I'm very happy to be chairing tonight's lecture from the Sussex Development Lecture series, hosted by the Institute of Development Studies, the School of Global Studies, the Science Policy and Research Unit, and us, the Centre for International Education. The series for this year focuses on COVID-19 and development, building back better, with that all-important exclamation mark. I would like to welcome Mark Schofield, who is English to British Sign Language interpreting this event. I would invite people to please tweet the event using the hashtags Sussex Dev and Global Dev Trends. The lecture will be available to watch after the event via the IDS website and YouTube. In terms of housekeeping, please would you mute your microphones unless, of course, you're speaking. And comments and questions are going to be very welcome from the audience, presumably after our speakers have finished halfway through. If you could please put your questions in the chat room in Zoom or the comments box on YouTube, and we'll select some for those to be discussed. I'd like to introduce our two speakers for tonight. Yusuf Sayed is a Professor of International Education and Development Policy at the Centre for International Education. He was the South African Research Chair in Teacher Education and the founding director of the Centre for International Teacher Education at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology in South Africa. Previously, Yusuf was Senior Policy Analyst at the EFA Global Monitoring Report UNESCO. He was a team leader for Education and Skills, the Department for International Development the UK, and the head of Department of Comparative Education at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. Fazal Rizvi is Professor Emeritus at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and it's now 4 in the morning for him, I've discovered, and at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the United States. He has written extensively on issues of identity and culture in transnational contexts, globalization, education policy, higher education, and Australia-Asia relations. His most recent books include a co-authored volume, Class Choreographers, Elite Schools and Globalization, and a co-edited volume, Transnational Perspectives on Democracy, Citizenship, Human Rights and Peace Education. Together, Yusuf and Fazal will tonight be discussing COVID-19 and development, education policy in the Global South. Just to run through a little bit of the blurb, the COVID-19 pandemic starkly reveals the failures and fragilities of education systems, laying bare existing education inequities, which in times of crisis further marginalise those with limited and poor quality education opportunities. But too little attention has been paid to who is involved in education policy making and the needs of frontline teachers and learners from marginalised and impoverished backgrounds. And if I could just interject here with a reminder of that 90% of children and youth, 1.2 billion, are currently out of school. And although there are some innovative alternatives to learning offered by teachers and schools, and there are agile responses by ministries of education in the Global South, such as remote learning platforms, radio, TV, home learning resource packages, accelerated learning micro classes. A third, however, of the most disadvantaged students are unable to access any learning, and many will not return to schools post the pandemic. And of course, huge numbers globally are missing out on nutritious school lunches. So in this lecture, Yusuf and Fazal will discuss the politics of education policy making during the pandemic. They will look at the decisions made around education and the impacts on equity and quality, reflecting on what building back better in education might look like. Yusuf.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Joe. And thank you for the organizers for inviting Fazal and I to engage in a conversation. The way Fazal and I will structure our conversation is I'll make a few opening remarks and pose a series of provocations and questions and issues for Fazal and I both to reflect on and to consider. Because in particular, what we would like to talk about and engage in dialogue with you and between ourselves is around policy making in times of crises. Who makes policy? Who gets to make policy? What evidence gets used? We'd also like to reflect on the kinds of choices that are made in policy around education. We'd like to look at, for example, why the strong rush to online learning, what are its effects, what are its impacts. We'd also talk a little bit about what gets ignored in times of crises as it comes to education. And then later on, we'll get into a dialogue between us and with you around what do we see this new normal looking like? What do we mean by building back a better normal? What do we envisage as the future of the post-COVID world and the new policy imaginary? Because there's no shortage of scenarios and ideas around what it looks like. And hopefully we can talk about that as well. So let me start by making first a few remarks. And in these remarks, I'm drawing on some of the work we did with the Open Society Foundation, Education International, and the International Task Force for Education 2030 at UNESCO, as well as the International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa, on a report on teachers and curriculum as it relates to times of uncertainty. And fundamentally, I think our starting point, as Joe has made, is the pandemic has not only revealed the fault lines of inequity, but it also exacerbated inequities. In other words, not only does it reveal the fragilities and frailties of education provision, and generally societies, but it exacerbates them. For example, we do know that at least as a result of the pandemic, and I'm just looking for the data now, that in 2017, there were 689 million people who lived on less than $1.90 a day, which is the measure of extreme poverty. But what the pandemic has done, it's pushed another 88 million to 115 million people into extreme poverty. And this is a very basic measure of extreme poverty. In fact, what the COVID pandemic has done is jeopardized the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in that sense, it's a telling story of the fault lines of inequality and poverty in particular. But crucially, what COVID is telling us is that it's not just a pandemic of health, because while much of the attention has been on health, it's a pandemic of social sector provision, because as recent events in the UK reveals, the people suffering most from COVID and school closures are children who use schooling for free school meals or for whom schooling is the only source of a meal a day. In times of closure, not only are they denied that right to social sector provision, but as in the UK, it gets passed on to a profiteering private sector business company. So while the economy may be struggling during times of COVID, not all companies are doing too badly as a result of COVID. But I would like to quote Michel in particular, who says, COVID-19 is a stark reminder that our assault on the natural world has consequences. Humans may not have created the coronavirus, but we have certainly cultured the unnatural conditions needed for nature to toss us a $10 trillion time bomb in our economy. In other words, the point about COVID is that it's a crisis that not of health, it's a crisis of education and a crisis of sustainable development and our interaction with the environment. But more importantly, COVID as a crisis is a crisis that's new to one extent and has been generalized. As Joe mentioned, most of the schools have been closed and most of the learners have at one point or another been impacted by the the absence to engage with schooling. But in many senses, for children who live in extreme marginalized conditions, for children living in conflict, for migrants, the experience of lack of access to quality and equitable schooling has always been there. In many senses, what COVID has done is that it made the experience of quite a large number of children who remain invisible in our understanding the experience of all. And in that sense, it's prompted policy elites whose children also get impacted by education to take education a little bit more seriously and plan. And in that sense, that's what we'll come to. The next opening remark I want to make about COVID is that the crisis in 2020 of COVID has also been accompanied by other protests and other issues which have revealed the fault lines of the society in which we live in. In one level, there's been the calls for social justice in education, the call for decolonization of education in South Africa and many other countries. There's also been the Black Lives Matter protest movement, which has shown the fault lines of inequities in the US and in us, and who's asked us. Collectively, these protests have asked sharp questions about whose knowledge counts, which voices and whose voices get heard, whose interests matter in policy, who gets represented in policy and how. In that sense, what COVID is, it's not a unique occurrence, although it's new and unique to an extent, but it comes on the back of existing process. It relates to existing protests, and it intensifies existing frailties and fragilities. So I'm going to make three sets of remarks as a way of asking Fazal to reflect on something. One is the policy process. One of the things that we know about the way policy has been made in COVID has been twofold, Fazal. One we've known is that the voices of those for whom decisions are often made have been least represented, in particular teachers, parents, and learners. Often there's been a strong, what one would argue, a certain kind of expertise that's been privileged in the processes of policy making. And primarily that's been the expertise of a particular kind of evidence, mainly natural sciences. So it's been your epidemiologists, your vaccinologists, your scientific research. In other words, it's privileged a particular kind of scientific knowledge as evidence, and it's elevated that as the basis. And often that evidence has not only been used, but it's also been misused by governments to justify it. So part of what we need to reflect is who gets involved in the policy making and what counts as evidence in policy. And in particular, a phenomenon we speak about in our paper, the idea of policy reach and overreach. And in particular, by policy overreach, what we're talking about here is the extent that when people who get roped into policy advisory task force and coronavirus command councils begin to make policies and make decisions or stray into the public space. For example, in the paper we talk about the whole issue of Professor Gray, who was the chair of the Medical Research Council and one of the key leading figures in the debate around the opening and reopening schools, who began to engage in dialogue, which the government construed as straying into their terrain. That's the first thing I think we want to reflect on. Secondly, in education policy making, we want to reflect on the centralized, command-driven emergency mode in which policy is made. Every country has some form of command council, some form of emergency legislation. What does that tell us around how participation occurs? And what does that tell us about how spaces for democratic participation and participatory forms of engagement in policymaking is possible? And what does that tell us also, and the way in which science gets used, tell us about the nature of scientific evidence and how we make sense of contradictory evidence. So that's one of the key issues, Fazal, that I think we want to open the provocations after. The second is the issue around education choices. And in many senses, all the choices and all the literature tells us that whichever way we look at it, the choices that they've made has revealed that the group that's managed the best from COVID and the closure of schools or the ways education has been provided has been a minority wealthy, a minority elite in each country. The majority lacking in cultural capital, lacking in access to data, lacking in technology, have been disadvantaged. But one of the key things that has been occurring during COVID in curriculum terms, and I want to talk first about curriculum and invite you to reflect on this, is that we notice that the way governments have thought about curriculum and the way that policy advice have been given about curriculum can be summed up in the idea of an obsession with protecting learning content at all costs. So there's an obsession with learning days lost, as if content learning is the only thing that happens in schools. Curriculum coverage has become almost the dominant leitmotif about how we've thought about curriculum change. We've thought about assessment, not in terms of finding alternative forms of rethinking high stakes exams, but about how do we deal with rescheduling exams. In other words, there's an assumption that what we've lost is quite a bit and that what we need to recover is what we had before. In other words, what does a content-centric notion of curriculum and learning and teaching tell us? Does it, and how does it ignore the sociality of learning and the relational dimension in teaching and learning as an engaged dialogic activity? Secondly, I want us to reflect on, Fazal, on the idea of this whole idea of online learning. But I think we don't want to talk about online learning because we want to talk about what we see as the stealth privatization of public education occurring under the pandemic. And there are several ways in which this is occurring. One is obviously through online learning. The beneficiaries of online learning has been edtech companies. Recently in South Africa, Curo has opened up a new school called Curo Online, targeting parents and families who are keen to do that. Similarly, private tutoring, homeschooling, all have been privatization. I'd like you to reflect on that. Lastly, Fazal, and I'll hand over to you now, I would like you to reflect on the absences in the education discourse during the pandemic. And there are two notable ones I want you to reflect on. One, there's been a remarkable silence about anything called effective learning, anything around psychosocial element, as if content and cognitive content has been the dominant. And secondly, I want us to reflect on the absence of teacher preparedness, but also teacher well-being as a core part of our discourse of thinking through the pandemic. I'll pass over to you, Fazal, now to share with us some of your reflections on this, and then we'll begin to talk about what we might consider as a post-COVID or building back a better normal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. To begin with, I want to thank you very much and to Sussex International Development Series for inviting me to participate in this seminar. It's now 12 months since we first learned of COVID out of China and then, of course, around the world. The impact of COVID on developing countries has been incredibly uneven. Some countries have managed it very well, some countries have not. And I think if you reflect on it, the countries that have managed it really well, initially anyway, during the first wave, were the countries in Africa with the experience of Ebola. And as a result, they were able to rely upon the systems that they had developed 10 years earlier. And that had helped them a great deal to know what to do. So experience, the grounded experience matters. And yet the grounded experience was always in conflict with global advice that many countries were getting, which were highly generalized, predicated on the assumptions of COVID in the developed world rather than the developing world. In East Asia, the experience of SARS was very readily used. So for example, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in places like that, it was possible for people to go to use masks very quickly because they had done it about a few years earlier. So I think experience, especially the grounded experience, matters. And of course, the decline in the number of people who were now moving country to country, from cities to rural areas, declined. And as a result, that helped as well. Medical facilities were not overcome in the ways that many had feared. And yet, in some other parts of the world, the response and the experiences were absolutely disastrous. I think about the examples of South Asia and Middle East. The systems just did not cope, at least for those who lived on the margins of the society. I want to use the example of the city of Delhi, which has a population of around 20 million. The image of Delhi is this thriving new metropolitan city. And yet Delhi is also a 50% rural city. In other words, of the 20 million people who live in Delhi, 10 million of them are recent migrants from very, very poor and economically straitened village conditions. They are living often in the streets. They're living in very unreliable housing. All of them, there was no provision for. And as a result, they remained in the street. And as the news went out that there was a dangerous pandemic, they started moving back to their villages. But there were no transport arrangements made for them. And there was no schooling that was replaced for them. They were left to fend on their own. So when we are talking about the problems of how schools have dealt with it, we must also realize that a large number of people even in large metropolitan cities did not have access to schools or had access to very poor schooling. And of course, this revealed as to the extent to which the plans that the government was making, their policy response had a reference family in mind. They had in mind somebody who was living in a house, in a contained space, rather than an open space, a space which could be locked in. So the lockdown, the policy itself, really was designed for those who had houses to lock down in. And of course, there were a large number of people, even in cities like Delhi, there was the notion of lockdown simply didn't make sense. And of course, children were the ones who suffered the most. Not only did they find themselves without the incomes of their parents, because these parents quite often lived at the edges of society, but they also were no longer able to rely on school lunches and so on. So the assumption of self-contained housing is one that we need to actually think about. What response was made to those people who did not have self-contained housing is a question that I've been thinking about as I found the experience and looking at the images of people, farmers, if you like, Delhi-based farmers, going back to their villages, often walking as much as 500 miles to get back to some measure of safety. The closure of schools' infrastructure, of course, was not only a problem. The online transfer or moving of instruction to online platform was also predicated on assumptions of a particular kind of family, a particular kind of family that had certain resources, certain ways of connecting back to schools, certain ways. And that is, of course, not possible. In India, a large number of people have mobile telephones, but these mobile phones are the old Nokias that can simply do SMS. They're not even sufficient to have conversation on. In other words, much of the material is for very, very basic purposes. And of course, again, the assumptions of online learning also were predicated on the economically secured rather than those people who lived on the margins of society with resources that were really quite limited. The teachers, of course, did not have any support. And yet, I have to say, we have to compliment the teaching body as a whole for what they were able to do. Of all the people who really cared about the poor, teachers were perhaps in the front line. The governments left the schools and the teachers to their own devices. And teachers did the best that they can, learning new skills, trying to do as much of extra effort as they possibly could. In the poorer schools, however, teachers did not even have the opportunity to put in the technology because they did not have the technology already anywhere. Now, when the corporations and governments started providing them with these technical support, the technical support came in the form of certain assumptions as well. In other words, education was shown to be linked to economic policy, to health policy, to transport policy, to a whole range of other policies. And that's one of the problems with educational policy processes. Quite often we assume education exists on its own. It never has, and it never will. You have to think about housing policy. You have to think about transport policy. You have to think about technology policy. You have to think about economic policy. And yet the coordination across policies was not as well done in many of the countries. And many of the countries, of course, did not have the capacity to do that coordination because their policy resources and their policy systems themselves are relatively poor and undeveloped. And I think that meant that the people who benefited from those policies were disproportionately the better off communities, the better off parents, and better off schools. And the consequences of these disparities are not only just beginning to become clearer in ways that wasn't even clear 6 months ago. There is evidence to show that large number of students who left school for one reason or another have not gone back and probably are unlikely to go back. So as a result, the progress that we have been making in increasing access may take a blip. It may go down in the next 2 or 3 years as we find that the schools are not able to invite the students who probably have abandoned schooling forever. Now, the COVID crisis, to my mind, reveals some deep contradictions of this kind in the ways in which policies are made, in the ways in which people are represented, and in ways the evidence is gathered and utilized. I have used the phrase actuarial thinking. In other words, a quantitative kind of thinking about whole groups of people, leaving aside their actual lives, their conditions in which they live. Actuality has become the focus of thinking rather than Arjuna Puttarai, thus the anthropologist, has drawn a wonderful distinction between ethic of probability and ethic of possibility. We have worked on ethic of probability, in other words, quantitative thinking, rather than getting together to think about what is required in particular circumstances. We've already seen that there are a whole range of governance reforms that had been taking place have shown themselves to be inadequate, insufficient in dealing with the crisis. The audit culture, for example, that has become more and more ubiquitous has shown itself incapable of dealing with the contingency, complexity, and crisis. It has focused on one set of group of people at the expense of others. Commercialization of education has shown also to be inadequate. Indeed, public schools were the ones who were quite often able to deal with the problem better than the low fees schools created by such organizations as Bridge International. They simply abandoned the space as they had not contracted to look after their schools in the times of crisis where they could not generate incomes and various returns. Technology, we've already pointed to. There has been an incredible reliance and march towards technology, but that technology obviously favors the already privileged. The equity agenda has clearly been sidelined, and the evidence is now coming in, and we have become absolutely clear as to the ways in which the inequalities of the systems have been laid bare. The state has lost the capacity and of course, and the expenditure to address the issue. So as we go forward, it really is an interesting question as to how, given these difficulties and given the fact that our systems have favored or had already favored those who were privileged and those communities who could afford to actually survive such a thing, how is that going to work out? In my view, there is every likelihood that the global corporations are already positioning themselves to take advantage of the crisis. Now, we know that after Katrina, and this relates to the work of Naomi Klein about shock doctrine, as to how corporations take the opportunity, take the crisis, and manipulate it so that they are likely to be benefit from it much more than others. Now, to me, I've been focusing on three organizations. Microsoft, as to how they are preparing and imagining post-COVID future, and how is it that they are trying to organize themselves to even generate greater amount of revenues, produce more capital for their shareholders than they had in the past, especially in the developing world. So it's important for us to look at Microwire and Microsoft as to how they develop systems going forward that will deal with the post-COVID world. The Bridge International is also an institution that I'm looking at as to how they might restructure their financial model and their capital accumulation model so that it favors more communities than simply those communities who can even make the minimum of the fees, even the so-called low fees. The third organization that I'm looking at is the Pearson Private Limited, and in particular, their efficacy framework. Now, we had already realized that efficacy framework had been based on models of public management, new public management, financialization, commercialization, and audit culture. Exactly how they position themselves to measure and to understand the requirements of a post-COVID world is something that I'm interested in. So I'm actually wondering now, given the role that these corporations, the global education industry plays in education and has been allowed to play a greater and greater role, how they will work with the public sector and how they will further develop their commodities that they produce, their devices that they employ, and explore how they will use those to further their capital accumulation strategies. And to me, that it really is quite a good question. So we shouldn't only be looking at what the governments will do, we should also be looking at what the corporations and global education industry might do. And as a result, the policy is going to be a very complex mixture of private and public interventions of various kinds. Exactly where the community will be involved, of course, then becomes an important question. And as to how the communities, private corporations, and public policy mechanisms come together is something that I think we might want to think about going forward. Yusuf, over to you.
Yusuf, you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted.
Just have a final, if you can make a final
Sure.
reflection, Yusuf, and then we can open it out to the audience.
I think so. I think our final reflection between Fazal and I in a minute or so is just to say, so what do we do about this? You know, how do we respond to this crisis? And just two things I'll say, and then I'll pass to Fazal. First, there's no shortage of prophets, pundits who are telling us what to do. People are advocating we need learning recovery programs when school begins. People are saying we need forms of collective accountability. Others are saying we need to bring back the private sector. Others are saying that what we learn from COVID is the flipped classroom is a reality, and therefore this has brought about quicker the fourth industrial revolution and technology as part of education. I think it's going to be a lot to talk about, but 2-3 points I want to make in this and pass over to Faiz. In all of this solution, there's very little talk about who is it that's going to do it. And more importantly, the most important constituency, the teachers, who are ultimately the frontline and street level implementers. It is not a surprise that in South Africa, for example, that unions say that they as much frontline workers as nurses and doctors are, because in a sense, they see the learners daily if schools reopen. So what do we think? There are 3 things I want to make. One is, I think, drawing on Fazal. Corporations are not only moving in, they've already moved in. They're not only shaping the platforms, the technology, the equipment, the hardware used, but they're also beginning to shape the software of it, the content, the assessment forms, the textbooks, making the learning available online, and commit with a particular, inserting a particular ideology. In that, the clear thing is we need a clear government policy around how you regulate the private sector and the corporations and their role in education. And to that must be added to defend the public good dimension of education and state oversight. Because the countries that did do well are those countries with strong public education systems and strong governments with strong policy environments, such as Cuba. And in that sense, we need to tackle the creeping and stealth privatization through crisis responses. Secondly, we mustn't make a mistake. We run the risk in education of educational budgets being cut in a post-COVID world as the economy takes more priorities or other sectors. We need to defend a holistic policy world and holistic thinking in which education as a social sector still remains priorities. Thirdly, we need to rethink some dogmas and ideas such as high-stakes exams, for example, such as content-obsessed curriculum. But crucially, we also need to establish, as the consensus document of unions and governments suggested in Africa, that you need a collaborative framework in which there's a commitment to increasing available financial resources, strengthening the effectiveness of consultations that actors, committing to recognizing education as a global public good, and that education to equitable and quality education is a basic right for all. and that we need to support a renewed vision of an education system committed to equity and social justice for all. I think I'll pause there and give Fazal a chance just to say a few words and open up for questions. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. Fazal, would you like to just finish off relatively briefly, if you don't mind? There's quite a few questions coming on, which is great.
I think he's asked about 20 questions. I'll answer one or two. Okay. I think the budget, the finances that will be required. I fear a great austerity era coming again, if it has ever disappeared in the first place. Much of the money that the governments will have will be required for the health sector. And you know that the health sector is going to make huge claims, especially in relation to the vaccine and the vaccination of people. And exactly which of the sectors that are going to be squeezed in order to make possible all the remedial actions that will need to be made in relation to health and economic. Now, I think this is where your idea of bringing these areas together and not actually assuming that one takes priority over others, where if you like, departments fight against each other for greater slice of the pie and reducing others to be becoming beggars is going to be a really, really important thing. And yet I can already see how the costs associated with vaccination and economic recovery are the ones that are being focused on rather than things that are needed for basically 40% of the population of the young, if you like, because those are the people that are important. The contents-related curriculum, I'm afraid, has every possibility of becoming even further entrenched at the expense of sociality of education, at the expense of affective, emotional learnings and all those other things. And yet, going forward, it may be that they are much more important. So the idea of remedial education or catch-up education or compensatory education always focuses on content and commodity rather than other social dimensions. And I think teachers will find themselves not being able to offer the content in context where there are deep well-being problems, there are deep emotional and social problems. So exactly how we look at it is going to be something that not only the governments will have to pay much more attention, but I think us as educational researchers will have to pay much more attention and become much more of a louder voice in making sure that issues of broadening education, the purposes of education, and broadening the conceptions of education are not forgotten. The global common good is, of course, an important aspect of this debate, but already it is becoming clear that the aid agencies, for example, which had actually, in the name of global good, been giving aid, as they themselves are put under financial pressures, they may not have the resources I'm thinking about the British government and DFID, for example. At the moment, it might be possible that they are prepared.
I'm going to be very rude and just interrupt because we have questions coming in and we don't have an awful lot of time. So can I thank you both very much? But we have got questions, but I'd also like to invite the audience to write in questions in the chat box or on Zoom. And just while they're coming in, if I can just very briefly pull together a 1-minute reflection. It's to my mind, it's a very pessimistic view of Arend Harty-Roy's portal that you portray, one of commercial recontextualization with the big software companies coming in, rather than a chance for real alternative approaches where you might think about teaching and learning as relational, perhaps in smaller units, and especially with, say, younger children who need that, and who, it seemed to me, that's another absence of young children. You learn to read and to write and compute through interaction with an adult, a more capable peer, and it's this, suddenly everything will happen as we are here on Zoom in some very decontextualized way. So yes, I suppose I'm struggling to see a positive side, because what you're saying about the norm of, you know, the idea of policymakers coming to their work with an inclusive understanding of education isn't there if a small minority of children are the ones who have been catered for. So let's take a few questions from the chat. The first one, and this is for either, is from Ariana de los Cobos. To what extent could privatization be an opportunity for education in this time, or certain privatizing factors? I mean, I suppose, could that be turned into a global good in any way? That's a good starting question. Continue on from where you were for both of you.
I think privatization has become an inevitability. The question is not privatization, but what kind of privatization? And how does the government manage that privatization so that it is much more beneficial to, it benefits greater parts of the community rather than only those people who can afford it. To my mind, the governments do not have the money and the resources to be able to make the entire system a national or public system. So some element of private is always going to be there. But the question really is, how do we make sure that this privatization is driven by greater goods, given that their primary objective is to create value for shareholder value, okay? Given that they are interested really, ultimately, in accumulation strategies rather than other strategies. So to me, privatization, a serious conversation about privatization is needed. That does not simply reject it out of hand, but actually explores the questions of what, how, and for whom.
Okay, thank you. Actually, we've got quite a few questions. There's two which are related, which I'll just give out on and about the technology. One from Vicky Pendry, this is again to both of you, but I'll give both, is about if you consider radio, SMS and other social media, those can lead to communities sharing learning materials. So does that give a more positive spin to the commercialization that you've been talking about? And from someone who hasn't given their name, is there any possibility about the advancement and over-reliance on technology? Could it in fact provide greater opportunities to further advocate? If, for example, that could really include children and youth with disabilities. So there are two different questions there. If you could both answer. Perhaps Yusuf, you want to start with one there.
Sure. I mean, I think while understandably a lot of the conversation has been, if you like, about these new technologies of computers and tablets and cloud computing, I think the low cost earlier technologies of radio are clearly important. But even then, there are questions about their reach to particular remote and rural location. There are also questions about what materials gets made available through these mediums. So it's as much about content as about hardware. But if they are, as the suggestion is, used for locally sharing locally generated ideas and knowledge, then that's certainly a good thing. I read the question about inclusive education, and our Fazal can comment, but my view is yes. I don't think online or face-to-face solves the problem of inclusive education. It's about how you change the institutions and its policies and its practice. It's about changing the ways in which we provide education in order to make inclusion a possibility. It's not simply just a question about shifting around technology. I think it's possible, but I think it requires a lot more thought and reflection. Fazal?
I think technology is here to stay, a bit like privatization is here to stay. Again, the question is, how does it get used? One of the disappointing things, and I'm sorry to be making yet another negative comment, is that the examples that I have seen of moving from classrooms, physical classrooms, to has been really quite disappointing at this and in this way, that the material that was content driven has simply been dumped through the technology. In other words, it's no different to the old correspondence school or old distance education, where content has been the thing that they have has been focused. We have failed to imagine new kinds of pedagogy, new kinds of relationalities. And I think that's actually what we need to do with the technology. Cheaper technology that actually doesn't only focus on content and syllabi and covering and all those other metaphors that are used, but also on some other ways of building learning communities so that students have a stake in the learning rather than treating it as simply knowledge to be absorbed in some uncritical fashion.
And thank you. And that very usefully goes to Ricardo Sabati's comment about the need to remember adults and adult learning in this. Mm-hmm. I mentioned what I thought was an absence around considerations for ECD, but it's communities and parents and often mothers who are teaching children home learning and are the primary teachers anyway. So Ricardo asks, I wonder if you can reflect on the role of adult learning, particularly that of parents who've taken a central role in the education of children. And as a subsector of education, adult learning only covers less than 5% of educational budgets. I'll leave that on its own. Perhaps you could just answer that one briefly now, and then we'll go on to the last few.
I think the role that parents and mothers in particular have played has been not as significantly discussed as it ought to. I know that it has created a whole range of anxieties in some families where they have suddenly been asked to do a task that they're not prepared for, or they didn't feel that they were prepared for. Other mothers and fathers have taken on the task of home learning and remote learning absolutely like duck to water. But a lot of those people have been left feeling inadequate. And I think this is where adult learning is most important. We've got to remember that teaching is not simply teaching of a particular group of people. When we teach, we learn as well. And as a result, to me, the distinction between, if you like, school learning and adult learning quite often is overdrawn. It's how you bring those two together. That has been an issue that has been highlighted by the COVID crisis, in my view. Yusuf?
No, we'll go to other questions.
I think there are two again related. Going back then, the two next questions, one from Yunus Omar. So it's going back and talking about that sense of how can we how can one engage the necessity of maintaining principled unity across all those many sectors that now more than ever policymakers do need to work together, which is what you've discussed. Will the future brought about by COVID-19 force education policy analysts to work more determinedly in collaboration with other researchers, for example, as well? So there are two questions there. One is about how can policymakers actually work together? I'm interested in that. And then how do they, what is the mechanism for actually then talking about those communities where adults are learning and teaching? And then one from someone who hasn't put their name up, related about then if we're talking about the public sector, you know, the public sector is the one that can give the social protection. And there's a danger if we talk too much, or if the private sector comes in too much, doesn't this mean that the poor are going to be left out more than ever? What can be done for those extremely poor, because the rest will be all right with Pearson or whoever jumps into the gap there? So two different questions there. Yusuf, do you want to take one or both?
Sure.
Well, 4 minutes left.
Very quickly, I think just to underscore the obvious point that Fazal and I made at two levels. One is that in tackling the education consequences of COVID, you'll need to have joined up policy making, to using a whole word, right? You'll need to work across government departments, across government entities, across different policy makers as well. For example, you can't resolve the issue of access to online learning if you don't deal with the issues of technology, infrastructure, and data costs, for example, right? You can't resolve the issue of the integration of school feeding and social welfare if you don't deal across other issues. And even within education, as Eunice and Ricardo, I think, are saying, you need to work across sectors, because I was just struck by a statistic that I read this morning. In a survey, over 2/3 of support at home was provided by women as mothers, guardians, and carers. Disproportionately, the burden of not care, but also education fell on women. And what support is provided in that sense for women who also struggle with the absence of the close down of childcare facilities at the same time. So there's a whole series of interconnected policy problems that need to be addressed, I guess. Okay, I'll pause there, Joe. Okay.
I think we do have an opportunity to rethink some of these issues. I mean, many of these issues are not entirely new, although they have been brought into stark relief in the context of COVID. But if we actually simply think that there were things that we were not able to do as a result of COVID, then we would have missed an opportunity of rethinking some of these questions about cross-sectoral relations, joined up governments in much more profound and much more innovative and creative ways than we might otherwise do. And also, of course, the question that you raised about the researchers, the policymakers, the teachers, the parents, the students doing research together and trying to actually figure out what the issues are and how is it that they can work with those issues, try out new solutions, and being. So I think there are opportunities, but exactly how those opportunities are going to be utilized is something that we need to actually start thinking about as researchers, as educational thinkers, and start writing about the possibilities much more than simply the analysis of the problems that we have clearly encountered.
And just to end up, Pat Drake, talks about, if you can comment on the extent to which education is a global product and education as locally and contextually determined by teachers themselves, which might be a good way to end, whether, the whole sense of teacher agency and teachers being freed up to do the kind of learning that they want, even if, as Pat says, it's not visible through technology. So at a very local level, can you just quickly say, very quickly, what could that look like? We've talked about the big policy at a very local level. what could education look like if you think about that portal? We have 4 seconds each.
Yusuf.
Two things, right? I think I like Pat's question because in the end, ultimately what we're saying, it boils down to teacher agency. And one of the unintended plus sides of the COVID pandemic is that it reasserted the centrality of teacher assessments in high-stake exams. And it made the point that ultimately it's up to teachers to decide what to trim, how to cover the curriculum, and not centralized government. And in that sense, I think Pat's absolutely right. The unintended effect of COVID has been the reassertion of the space that teachers occupy in the classroom to do the things. And going out of COVID, or the building back a better normal, must be protecting that space for teachers to do what they can do in the classroom, supported by policy.
In my mind, education is always in, local and local practices that matter. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that we don't draw resources from a whole range of other places globally. And that doesn't mean that we don't stretch our students' imagination towards the global. But ultimately, all these things happen at the global level, at the local level, where the communities come together to figure out what education means to them. So instead of having a transcendental meaning of education, we really need to come to think about education as locally enacted.
Yes. And on that note, I think we'll end it with the idea of teachers doing the kind of teaching they want to, perhaps not so absolutely focused on content, but also beware, as our last writers put, about teacher burnout, which we know is happening in this country. And if teachers aren't getting paid, especially if they're in low-fee private schools, then that is a problem. I would like to thank our 2 speakers, Yusuf Sayed and Fazal Rizvi, and I'd like to thank you all for logging in and for some excellent questions that made us think. And the next event will be on preparedness and response to future pandemics. God forbid. This isn't supposed to be the only one. And you can find all that on the Sussex Development Lectures website. So thank you very much. And I hope, Fazal, you can get some sleep. It's probably now 5.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. And thank you to the organizers.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Mark, for